Well, good afternoon and welcome to the CSUB Bakersfield Wednesday webinar series. I'm Kelly Bearden, Director of the CSU Bakersfield SBDC, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. And we're coming live to you from the Mid-State Development Building in downtown Bakersfield. Thank you for joining us today. I think we have an outstanding webinar on really an area that we can all improve in, and that's performance in the workplace using strength finders to that advantage. So first of all, a little bit about the SBDC program. As many of you are aware of, there are over 1,000 centers across the country, primarily funded by the U.S. Small Business Administration. Locally, you saw our sponsors earlier. We're sponsored locally by the School of Business and Public Administration at CSUB, the County of Kern and Mid-State Development, but nationally it's the SBDC program sponsored by SBA. So a couple things. This is our 14 county Central California region, and here out of the Bakersfield office we service all of Kern, Inyo, and Mono County. It's kind of like, you know, Kern County's not big enough. We needed Inyo and Mono also. So proud of all three companies, proud of all three small businesses, business communities in that region. So it's great to serve that area. So a little bit about our webinar action today. If you have a question, please send us a question. We will do our best today. If we have time to get to questions, if we don't have time, we will be getting back to you with questions. I know we have a full event planned for today. Also, all of our attendees are muted. We will be sending out an email survey after the event, and we'll try to get handouts available to you as well if you'll need to mention that on the survey that you return. So a little bit about what we do at the SBDC is we provide high quality, no cost, confidential one-on-one consulting. So we are basically the technical service provider in the region with 15 senior level consultants, a variety of expertise that they have. We also are blessed with 6 undergraduate students at CSUB to serve as student interns and do a fantastic job as well. Training is another one of our main topics that we get into. And today our training is on webinars, but at times it's on seminars or conferences. And sometimes we get into in-depth classes in other areas. So if you want to connect with us at the SBDC, we're on a variety of social media platforms. So please look us up. There's our contact information. We do have a telephone number, and you can contact us by email if you're so inclined. So it's great. I'm really excited about today's webinar. And we have joining us from Sacramento, we have joining us Zane Graves. And he's a subject matter expert in the area. And I'll bring you in just a second, Zane, so hold patiently. Employment, engagement, strength finders, base development, 5 years experience with team building, and he's a millennial. It's great. So anyway, Zane, I'm not going to hack your introduction any further. I'm going to let you tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Zane Grace. I'm here today representing 34 Strong, and we're going to be talking about the Gallup Strengths Finder as a human development tool within organizations. So a little bit about 34 Strong. We are an employee engagement consultancy. What that means, our tagline, we call ourselves the voice of the disengaged employee. So one of our big goals when we work with organizations to help transform them into great places to work, to make sure that when people get out of bed, they're looking forward to coming into work that day, they're excited about their jobs and the people they work with. In short, they love why they do what they do, they love what they do, they love who they do it for. Those are the hallmarks of a highly engaged workplace. Today we're going to be talking about leading with strengths. So there's a couple different pieces to that, but we're going to dig really deep into the Strengths Finder itself. There are many other human development assessment tools out there like DISC, Myers-Briggs, True Colors, Personalysis. whole slew of different options out there. What any assessment like this really is at its core is an opportunity to open up meaningful conversation within a team around how do I think, how do you think, how will I react in certain situations, what will I contribute, what do I need. We say that 90% of conflict within workplaces is not conflict of intent, it's just conflict of communication, meaning we all want the same things. We're all on the same team, working toward the same goal. It's just that I'm speaking my language, you're speaking your language, and something gets lost in translation. So what's helpful is having a universal language around which we can discuss how we work, how we behave, how we think, and it really takes the judgment away from it when we start to open the table up and have these sorts of conversations. So we'll go ahead and bring up this PowerPoint for you to go ahead and follow along with for the session today. All right, excellent. So go ahead and get into this. Tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm the employee engagement consultant for 34 Strong. That means that I help tailor our offerings to our clients, so I'm very familiar with the challenges that many workplaces are facing today. I'm personally a StrengthsFinder success story. I actually met the CEO of our company, 34 Strong, on a sales call about 5 years ago. And he told me, kid, you need some help. You're not a great salesperson. And he was right. I was one of the worst in my office. So our CEO, he had me take the StrengthsFinder, sat me down for a couple coaching sessions. And over the course of just a few months, I went from being the worst salesperson in my office to one of the absolute best. And then within 3 years, I was actually running that location. So when the CEO and I reconnected earlier in 2017, I made the decision that many millennials are making, which is to follow a path of purpose over a path of paycheck. It's really important to discuss that millennial problem because organizations don't quite know how to deal with us. We're tricky. We're presenting some challenges. Traditional methods of management and human development aren't working very well for us. So any sort of system that helps us to feel heard and engaged in our work is going to be really what differentiates companies moving forward, because the companies who understand how to attract and retain us are going to flourish, and the companies that miss the mark are going to end up going the way of Blockbuster and Kodak. So just a little preview about some of the millennial issues that we might be getting into today. As far as my personal StrengthsFinder results, I don't know about you, but I'm always really skeptical of anyone or anything who's going to try and tell me about me. So when I was first introduced to the StrengthsFinder, I admit to being more than a little skeptical. But as I dug into my results and had them explained to me, I really started to connect with this language. I almost felt like someone was following me around. My top strength, input. I soak up knowledge and resources. I've always been a fast learner. Inputs, love to collect things. From the time I was 4 years old, I had a rock collection, and I continue to collect things today, like Zippo lighters or any knowledge and resources that I like to share and help others out with. Restorative. I love solving problems. I've always been a great troubleshooter. I'm able to watch someone give a presentation and come away with 3 things they could have done better, which for those of us who have those tendencies to fix, to help, we have to learn how to manage it, because that feedback may or may not be welcome depending on how it's delivered. Communication, I've always excelled at putting thoughts into words, helping public speak, write, present, anything where I'm up in front of a room delivering is very invigorating to me. So that's a quick overview of some of my top 5 strengths. I was just really captured by this language that helped me to describe the way that I had always operated. Um, and so I became really curious as to how all of this works. So to give you a little overview of what we're going to cover today, uh, our first objective is talking about employee engagement itself and why we bother utilizing the StrengthsFinder as a tool at all. Second, we're going to be talking about personal leadership and some different options for increasing self-awareness through strengths. And then we're going to wrap up our talk today by talking about how leaders are utilizing the StrengthsFinder within organizations to affect the key outcomes that we all care about, like profit, profitability, efficiency, turnover, customer metrics, safety metrics. These are all things that employee engagement impacts very, very heavily. So as we get into this today, we're going to be talking about employee engagement and why we consider it the gateway performance indicator. So what I'm going to be presenting is this radical concept that engagement sits above all of these other metrics that we care about in organizations. Beyond the bottom line, maybe our human capital is truly the biggest lever that we can pull. So this brings to is this big shift in philosophy of how we want to develop our human capital. So this quote here, people don't change that much. Don't waste time trying to put in what was left out. Try to draw out what was left in. That is hard enough. This quote comes from a book called First Break All the Rules, which was a book that Gallup put out in the mid-90s that was essentially a love letter to corporate America saying, we think the way that you develop people stinks. And we think that you should be doing more to focus on what's right with them instead of what's wrong with them. So a little background on the StrengthsFinder itself. It was developed by Don Clifton, who was a positive psychologist in the 1950s. And around that time, there was no language to discuss what's right with us. Right? It was all, the entire study of psychology was, neurosis, what's wrong with us, how can we diagnose these issues. So there was a group of psychologists that said, let's focus on what's right, let's focus on what's positive. And some of them, like Jung, went off in the direction of personality and developed tools like the Myers-Briggs, for example. And those are excellent tools. We tend to prefer the Gallup StrengthsFinder because it's more actionable. If you take the Myers-Briggs test, you get 1 of 16 different results. So the odds of me having the same report as you are 1 in 16. But obviously we know that there are more than 16 different types of people. So when you take the StrengthsFinder, your odds of getting the same top 5 strengths in the same order as someone else are 1 in 33 million. So it's a much more individualized report, and it helps managers to be able to develop people along what we call the platinum rule. So the golden rule is treat others the way that you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat others the way they want to be treated. And that tends to work out a little bit better for our management philosophy. So Don Clifton, as he developed the StrengthsFinder, he actually purchased the Gallup organization, which we all know is famous for polling. So he was able to leverage the Gallup brand and their polling system to go out, and he spent 40 years studying human excellence, right? Because we have a language to discuss external talent, right? We see external talent very clearly in our society. We see it primarily in athletics and also in performing arts, right? These are areas where we tend to identify people that have talent very early on, and then most importantly, put them in the right roles to leverage that talent. So the basic concept here is, for any of you who have kids or have ever tried to coach a kid's sports team, I spent some time coaching girls soccer, 7, 8-year-old girls playing soccer. And for any of you who have ever been in a similar position, you figure out very quickly which little girls are there to compete and play soccer, and which little girls are there to pick flowers and make friends. And if you've ever tried to take a flower picking, socializing little girl and turn her into a soccer champion, you know that it is next to impossible. Because again, people don't change that much, and we identify that talent very early. So it's better to run with it than to fight against it. A good example for this is to think about the way that we traditionally develop people. We call it the deficit assumption. So the deficit assumption assumes that anyone can become competent at almost anything if they work hard enough, right? So this here is a sample report card for Madeline, right? Her 6th grade report card that she comes home with. Now, for anyone who's a parent, which grade do you probably focus on first? I'm gonna guess it was probably that C. And that's all of us. That's what we notice. And it tends to be because that's where we see the greatest room for improvement, right? If this child can take this C and turn it into an A, then wow, this child is almost perfect. Wink, wink, quote unquote. But this is a real story from our CEO. This is his daughter's report card that she brought home in the 6th grade. And newsflash, he saw the C first. He's been developing people through strengths for 15 years, and that was the first grade he saw because it's what we're trained to see. We learn this in school, we learn this from our parents, we learn this from our jobs, that the best way to develop people is by focusing on their weaknesses. But luckily, our CEO remembered what he did for a living that day, and he looked at his daughter Madeline and he said, "Madeline, do you like to read?" And she said, "Oh, Daddy, I love to read. When you think I'm going to bed at night, I'm staying up till 2 a.m. reading." Now, Brandon said, "If you love to read that much, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pay you to read. Give you an unlimited Amazon account this summer to get however many books you want. And what I want you to do is every book you read that's 100 pages, I'll give you $1. Every book that's 200 pages, I'll give you $2. And every book that's 300 pages or more, I'll give you $5. The catch was she had to write a book report on each one and submit it every week in order to get the cash. So what do you think happened? She made a lot of money that summer. Do you think that he had to remind her to read? Definitely not, right? So the quality of her book reports kept getting better and better and better. And the really interesting thing was her math grade rose also. So we found that she was so engaged in her reading that it actually motivated her to get better at the things that she wasn't as good at. Now, for those of you parents who've ever raised, young, becoming teenage girls, if he had taken a different approach and addressed that weakness directly and said, "Madeline, you know what we're going to do this summer? Math tutoring," probably wouldn't have gone so well. Probably would have gotten that big eye roll, right? So when we talk about the difference between an engaged and a disengaged employee, employee engagement is something of an epidemic in the world. So when we think about an engaged employee, we think about our best and our brightest, right? The people who show up early, ready to work, they take on more, they're self-starters, they create a good culture in the office, they raise others up. Those are our best and brightest. Now, worldwide, only 13% of the world is engaged in their jobs. Now, that number doesn't sound great. It's actually up from where it was 20 years ago. Now, if we look at the US numbers, if we just focus on manager engagement, the number of managers engaged at work is about 35%, which is not going to be a number that most of us would feel comfortable having in our organizations, especially when we consider that the Gallup research says that managers' impact on employee engagement by percentage is about 70%. So we no longer work for corporations, we work for people, right? And your experience at your job is most dependent on whoever you call boss, right? That's the person who's going to have the most influence over your experience. Uh, so the result of that is if we look at employee engagement in the US, we talk about people who are engaged at work, showing up the right way. That number is about 30%. So it's a definite improvement over the rest of the world because in America, we've been working with these concepts for the last 20 years or so. Something like 94% of Fortune 500 companies utilize the StrengthsFinder to some degree within their organizations. If we're talking about employees who are disengaged at work, disengagement looks like a trade, right? It's those employees who are trading their time for your money. And they show up when they have to, they leave as soon as they can, and they're trading a day's work for a day's pay. We don't get much more out of them than that. That number is about 50%. 50%, according to Gallup, show up this way in our organizations. And that doesn't sound great. But what's even more concerning is this last number, which is actively disengaged employees. So actively disengaged takes a step further to absenteeism, recruiting others into bad behavior, actively working against the organization. We call them cave dwellers, right? Consistently against virtually everything that you're trying to accomplish. So these people can be very challenging, and about 20% of our workforce shows up this way. So these actively disengaged people, by the way, are the most expensive by far. Gallup estimates show that this group alone costs the U.S. economy about $1 trillion a year to the U.S. GDP, and that is not an exciting number if we think about all the lost revenue, lost opportunities. But the reason this is so difficult to break is because engagement at work is only one half of the cycle, right? When people are engaged or disengaged at work, that absolutely follows them home. So what I always like to reference is when we were kids, we could always tell when our parents came home if they had a good day or a bad day at work, right? And we could tell by their attitude, the energy that they exuded. It was very obvious to us because it's impossible to compartmentalize to that degree. So if someone has a bad day at work, they're taking it home. They have bad personal relationships at home. It affects their well-being, and most importantly, it affects their sleep. They're stressed. And so then, do they take that back to work? Absolutely, yes, they do. So it's this cycle that just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. What Gallup says is that managers have the opportunity to influence the engagement side of this equation. And if we can do that, we're not just helping them at work, we are helping them at home, we're helping them throughout their lives holistically, right? And that's ultimately the goal, is not just to have strong workers, but build strong communities, strong companies, right? So what Gallup realized is that this is a very populist message, right? It's very agreeable to a lot of people, but they were faced with the so what question, and they needed to know how to measure it. So they developed what they called the Q12 engagement assessment in order to measure the engagement level of teams within organizations. And it took them 25 years to develop this assessment. They asked hundreds of questions to thousands of work groups. And what they were trying to figure out is, let's not study why people leave, right? Exit interviews are a very common practice, studying what makes people go and then trying to work backwards to figure out what the right behaviors are. Gallup said, well, let's just study why they stay and use that and do more of that. So they didn't know what they were going to find. They weren't sure if employees were going to care about upgraded workspaces, great relationship with their boss, salary and benefits. But they were surprised to find after their study that there were only 12 indicators that universally affected engagement. And it was these 12 right here on this pyramid. These are universally important to employees as to whether or not they will engage at work. So we say that these first three indicators are very foundational. If you don't have those, it's difficult for an employee to engage at work, even if all the rest of these are accounted for and operating at a high level. So if we look at some of the basics here, I know what is expected of me at work. Now, when an associate takes this survey, they'll go ahead and rate each of these statements on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 3 being neutral, and 5 being strongly agree. So if you've ever been in a role before where you strongly agree. So if you've ever been in a role before where you felt like you didn't know what your manager wanted from you, right? You consistently found yourself unable to meet their expectations. That's a very frustrating environment to be in. It's impossible to know if you're hitting the marks, and so you can't feel like your opinion counts. You can't feel like you're growing. You can't feel like you're doing good work if you don't know at a basic level what is expected of you. For the managers and leaders, if you've ever given instructions to a direct report and they came back with something completely different than what you asked for, that can also be a very frustrating experience. Setting expectations is something that sounds so simple, and yet for any of us who have led teams of people know, setting expectations for each individual on the team can actually be very challenging and sometimes frustrating. But if you have a little kid that you're trying to teach to look both ways before he crosses the street and he keeps running out into the street, do you stop setting that expectation for him because you've already told him once? No, you keep setting that expectation until he gets it, right? And that's how we have to treat our direct reports as well. Is if they don't feel taken care of on this very basic level, they're not going to perform for us the way that they want to. We won't go through all 12 of these indicators, but I'll just jump up to another one, Q7. At work, my opinion seems to count. If any of you have ever had a direct report bring an idea to the table, and then you end up implementing it within the organization, how engaged is that person after that? You get those shiny eyes, right? They're so bought in to what the organization's doing because they feel like their opinion has a say. So at the end of the day, these are the 12 indicators that Gallup identified. More than 30 million participants have taken the Q12 now. So the benefit of working based off of Gallup tools is that they overstudy everything. So all the science on this is very solid. Now, once an organization takes their people through the Q12, this is the sort of report that they would get back. So if an organization has more than 100 employees, they'll actually get this engagement index up here that will tell them the ratio of engaged to disengaged to actively disengaged employees. This is an organization that 34 Strong has had the pleasure of working with. They're a 100-year-old company, about 400 employees, and this is their overall score. So you can see that their percentile rank here is 25. Meaning that compared to every other organization in Gallup's database that's ever taken the Q12, this organization is more engaged than 25% of their competition. So obviously, this company was not feeling exceptional about their results. We also get a breakdown of each one of the 12 indicators by percentile once again. So these are percentiles compared to the rest of the Gallup database. This column is the number of respondents. So even though this organization had 400 plus employees, they only got about 220 responses. What that would indicate, or what it ended up being, is that this organization had 2 locations, a union and a non-union location, and one of those did not get a very high response rate. The benefit of this is that we can actually break it down into different teams, so we could see how the accounting team's doing in terms of engagement, how the marketing team's doing, the sales team. We can do a year over year, so that way we get some comparisons to benchmark to, and we can tell exactly how we're moving the needle. So this is just an overall example of a printout that an organization can receive when they go through the Q12. It tends to be a really useful tool for identifying which managers are doing an excellent job, which managers need some help, and specifically which target areas they might need to improve in. Now, as far as what it takes to move the needle on some of these, there are, again, many different options. Some organizations experience great success using Myers-Briggs, DISC, True Colors. We choose to use the StrengthsFinder because of the strong Gallup research that backs it. Again, they overstudy everything, so we feel very confident about the science that has backed this up. So what we'll get into next is the second objective, leadership, all about increasing self-awareness in personal strengths. Because what we find is the most effective leaders are the ones who have high levels of self-awareness. As self-awareness increases, self-judgment decreases, judgment of others decreases. So getting a handle on one's own personal StrengthsFinder report can be very powerful. So the code that cracks open your unique talent is called the Clifton StrengthsFinder. So as we saw earlier with my my top 5 strengths, when someone takes the StrengthsFinder, they receive their top 5 talent themes. And we define talent as a natural way of thinking, feeling, or behaving that can be productively applied. So when Don Clifton spent 40 years studying human excellence across all fields, he studied 2 million of the most effective leaders in business, politics, religion, whatever field you can name. What he landed on were these 34 themes of talent that he grouped together. And when someone takes the StrengthsFinder, they get those talents rated from 1 to 34. Someone can unlock their full list of 34, but the starter one is just getting the top 5 because those are the most intense. Those are the ones that we use on a daily basis that are our core talents. They're just in line with the way that our minds work, and there's not a lot that we can do to change it. Some common questions about the StrengthsFinder. It is the world's leading assessment in understanding a strengths-based strategy to human development. It is one of the real, true only options for taking a human development strategy Sometimes we get the question, well, what do we do about weakness? This almost seems too good. I'll get into that in a little bit in this presentation. Sometimes people ask, how is the assessment developed? It essentially forces you to choose between different kinds of talent events, right? Where every day we experience talent. Right? If we're in the exact same situation, you and I are going to respond differently to it based on our natural patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And that's what the StrengthsFinder helps to give a language to. So we say that your top 5 talents that you receive back are not your strengths. They can become your strengths if they're invested into with time, skills, knowledge. If we think about that 10,000 hour rule, it says that we have to spend 10,000 hours on something before we achieve true mastery of it. So to illustrate, we'll actually use another reading example. This case study comes about a decade ago from Omaha, Nebraska, and it was this this group that was trying to develop a 3-year-long speed reading course for children. So they took these average readers through the strengths reading course, and they started at 90 words per minute. After 3 years, they finished up at 150 words per minute. That's almost a 70% increase, which of course they felt outstanding about. They're feeling like, hey, this is really positive results. But the question then was asked, what if we instead start the people who are already very exceptional readers, kids who are reading high above grade level, they're reading 350 words per minute. Now, they went through the exact same 3-year speed reading course. So want to think to yourself, do you think they went up Think they went down? Do you think they stayed the same? If you thought they went up, the ups have it. The question now is how up? Think they went up just a little bit, that already sort of reached their potential and just got a little extra results? Do you think they went up a lot? Do you think they doubled even, tripled? If we remember, strength comes out of talent times investment, right? So these people who started at 350, and I want to emphasize, after they measured these results, they remeasured 3 times. The second group here not only increased their fluency, but also their comprehension. If you've ever watched a speed reader read and just flip pages, it's really impressive. This group went up to 2,900 words per minute. For those of you good at math, that's almost 50 words a second. This helps to illustrate the concept that you can build on a weakness. You absolutely can, and you might even become competent at that weakness. But will you ever truly achieve mastery over it? Will you ever become excellent, the top of your field? Probably not. What's a better result is starting in an area where you already have natural talent and building on it, investing in it in a very intentional way. If we go back to Madeline's report card, maybe that taking that C to an A isn't the greatest room for growth. Maybe the greatest room for growth is taking that A+ up all the way into the stratosphere, right? Now, again, we don't want to be bad parents. We want to make sure that we're encouraging people to develop holistically, but maybe the best path to that is by working on people's strengths, not trying to directly address their weaknesses. Now, everyone has talent, and we see it every day. So things like effortlessly starting conversations with people, thinking in an orderly or timely manner, being able to easily influence others, seeing patterns in data, consistently having a positive outlook on life. These are all talents that by themselves are just neutral. They're not good or bad, but they can be productively applied. So if we think about tying different behaviors into some of the StrengthsFinder themes, I want to give you some examples of the StrengthsFinder talent themes and the different behaviors that they correlate to. So do you always talk to people in elevators, airplanes, stores, or wherever you go? You might have a talent called woo in your top 5. Woo stands for winning others over. Very extroverted people. They tend to love making connections. They're great networkers, and they just have that gift of the gab. They love making friends in random places, and they tend to trust very quickly. Do you always write a list of things to do and stick to it? You might have a talent theme high for yourself called achiever, which is the StrengthsFinder talent theme associated with having a strong work ethic. It's associated with having drive, right? These people love to-do lists. They're the kind of people who will often add something to their to-do list that they've already done just to check it off and get that satisfaction of, having that release of accomplishment. Do you always need to pick someone to race while driving? If so, you might have a talent theme in your top 5 called competition. For a competition, second place is the first loser. They love winning. They love, the sport, the competitive atmosphere, and they're highly measurement oriented. So they often like to be aware of who's around them, what everyone else is doing, and where they're at. Do you always have a color-coded or otherwise organized closet? If so, you might have a StrengthsFinder talent theme high for yourself called arranger. Arranger is a theme that's comfortable with a lot of different moving parts. Think of like an orchestra conductor, right? So they like to arrange and rearrange. These are the people who are fiddling with the PowerPoint slide deck 5 minutes before they're ready to present because they had a great idea on how to restructure things at the last second. Do you always seek a familiar face at a big party? You might have a talent theme in your top 5 called relator. People who are high in relator, they deal in trust. So they prefer working with people that they trust closely. They like working with close friends, and often if they're determining who might be a good fit for a particular role or a particular task, they'll often think about who they've worked with before and who they trust the most. Whereas a different sort of talent composition might look at a directory, or they'll do some research, put an ad out, something like that. Relators often will gravitate towards people that they know and people that they relate to. Do you always clean your house or apartment before you can relax? If so, you might have a StrengthsFinder talent theme called responsibility, which refers to the psychological ownership over tasks that have been committed to. So often responsibility is one of the best ways for them to leverage that is to share their goals with others, because once they make their commitments public, they feel an internal drive to follow through on them. Oftentimes they will bite off more than they can chew because they want to please. They tend to hate being micromanaged. It's almost insulting for responsibility because, again, they take ownership, and that's their hallmark. Do you always figure out the plot of the movie before anyone else does? If so, you might have a talent theme high for yourself called strategic, which refers to the inherent ability to sort and select options. A quick note, these words that I'm using, the different talent themes, are different for StrengthsFinder than they are in the dictionary. StrengthsFinder is its own intact language. So that's actually why we start people off with just their top 5 instead of the full 34. Otherwise, they tend to look at the bottom 5 first, and it becomes weakness finder really fast. People saying things like, what do you mean I don't have any empathy? Or what do you mean I'm not strategic? In the StrengthsFinder definition, it just refers to strategic being a inherent way of sorting and selecting options. Do you always tend to be skeptical until given some proof? If so, you might have a StrengthsFinder theme called analytical. Analyticals love data. They love numbers. They tend not to be swayed by anecdotes. They want to see, the hard and fast data. Do you always trust your intuition? You might have a StrengthsFinder theme called self-assurance, which has a strong inner compass. It looks inward when it needs to make a decision, and it's very resilient. It has a lot of grit and bounce back because it has trust and faith in itself. It's a very grounded talent. And lastly, do you always push the elevator button to remind the elevator that you are there? This also works with crosswalks. If so, you might have a StrengthsFinder talent theme called activator. Might be a get it started kind of person. Do you ever find yourself being impatient, speaking before you think, ready, fire, aim? Or saying things like, okay, we've done enough talking, let's do something, let's jump into action, right? So these are all great examples of talents. Like we said earlier, these talent themes are neutral. They are neither good or bad. Much like superheroes and supervillains, they both have powers. It's all about how you use them. So we say that optimal theme utilization is a balcony, and the less than effective utilization of a theme is a basement. So this is the language that we use to talk about how themes can become strengths or weaknesses. Now, let's take a talent theme like achiever, which just refers to that strong work ethic. So in its balcony, it's tireless, it's hungry, it's a go-getter. In its basement, it's burning the candle at both ends. It's work-life imbalance. It's putting work before people, right? So having this language helps calibrate these up or down. And when a team has taken the StrengthsFinder within an organization, this really removes the judgment to where you can say to one of your coworkers, ooh, I think your basement's showing a little bit today. It becomes, not a stressful or aggressive conversation, but it just becomes a language that the organization can start to use to self-calibrate, right? And if we know anything, every basement that I've ever been in has a set of stairs going down and a set of stairs going back out. So having this self-awareness around how you're showing up allows you to recognize these patterns in yourself and have pre-thought out strategies to deal with yourself when you may not be at your best. So that's a huge benefit to teams within organizations. Go ahead and get into influence and talk a little bit about how leaders are using strengths within their organizations. So what I first want to talk about is the 4 domains. So this is a really useful shorthand for managing teams because within an organization, it might be a little while before you can remember, oh, Bob, he's a belief, significance, achiever, activator, right? But can remember, oh, Bob's an executor, Bob's an influencer, Bob's a relationship builder. That becomes a little bit easier. So when we get into that, here we have the domain, we have a description for each domain, we have the StrengthsFinder talent themes that correspond to that domain, and then each domain has its own contributions and needs. So in the executing domain, people know how to make things happen. They take thoughts and put it into action. So what they contribute is concrete reality, details, goals, processes. We call this the blueprint domain because it needs to know where we're going. It's a heavily task-oriented domain. So people with any of these StrengthsFinder themes are going to need practical steps in application. They want to see the end result, where we're going. They need systems. They need rules within which to operate. Influencing, these are the people, we call it the megaphone domain. They bring attention to issues. These are the rarer StrengthsFinder talent themes because they are very loud on a team. They bring energy, they bring promotion, they bring convincing, igniting. So these are the kinds of things that an influencer will contribute. They'll also need verbal processing, meaning influencers often need to see what they say before they know what they think. They need a cause to connect to, they need huge validation, and they need strong leadership. They don't have to be leaders themselves, they're often willing to follow, but in the absence of strong leadership, they absolutely will usurp the leader. They tend to jump straight over disengagement and head straight to active disengagement if they're not being well taken care of, which can be a problem because they will absolutely recruit others to their bad behavior. So it's important to understand who the influencers are on your team. Relationship builders. So this is actually the most important domain statistically. We call it the glue stick domain. It helps bring people together and make them greater than the sum of their parts. So if we look at sports teams, the most talented sports team does not always win. If you think about the Dodgers up until at least the last couple of years, arguably, objectively, one of the most talented teams out there, and yet year after year, like clockwork, falls apart as soon as the pressure gets put on. Because at the end of the day, they are a collection of I's and me's. They are not a we and an us. And that's what relationship builders bring to the team. People with these themes bring connection, inviting, listening, accepting, right? And what they need is encouragement. They need active listening. They need a non-judgmental environment. They need authentic relationships. So what they bring is very important in that they keep everyone together. They keep everyone focused, right? And then strategic thinking. So people with dominant strategic thinking talents, we call it the satellite domain because it's very high level. So people with these talent themes are going to provide information, direction, ideas, possibilities. These are the people who question. They're disruptors, right? They like to challenge the status quo. If any of you have ever heard, that saying, "This is how we've always done it," which if any of you hate that saying, I'm right there with you. I lead from this domain personally. And if you tell me, oh, this is how we've always done it, I'll come back with 10 new ways that we could do it and an argument for why some of them are probably much better. So if you're working with these people, they need to know the high level why and what. If you ask them to execute on something, but you don't tell them why, they're going to feel very lost because the why matters to them. They need room to explore and share those ideas and room to imagine. So often these people need time and space to think. Now, we say that the influencing and relationship building domains are people oriented, and the executing and strategic thinking domains are task oriented. Now, the differences: relationship builders connect to people, influencers connect through people, right? And then strategic thinkers and executors are both task oriented, but there tends to be a pretty natural rub between the two, where to executors, doing is doing, right? To strategic thinkers, thinking is a necessary part of doing. And there is a healthy, contentious relationship between the two. Now, if it's not managed correctly, absolutely butt heads in a not exciting way. But do those two domains need each other? Absolutely they do. So the idea here is that as individuals, we cannot be well-rounded, right? And the pursuit of well-roundedness as an individual is killing us and making us disengaged. However, teams can be well-rounded, and having a positive representation from each of these four domains is a really great first step to that goal. So as far as getting back to the bottom line of how this impacts organizations, Gallup did a meta-analysis in 2015 of work groups that received strengths-based development, which were found to have 14 to 29% increased profit, 3 to 7% higher customer metrics, 23 to 59% fewer safety incidents, which huge for any of us in industry, 10 to 19% increased sales, and 6 to 72% lower attrition. Now, these results are obviously very positive, but you might be asking yourself, well, why the range? Often when you see a meta-analysis, it's just one number. Well, what Gallup identified is that organizations on the lower end of the scale were just doing a task, right? They maybe onboard everyone through the Strengths Finder. All new employees take this test, right? And they get a little bump from it. A 7% increase in engagement is nothing to sneeze at. Think about, bringing up from that 30 to a 37. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you feel that in the organization. You absolutely do. Other organizations, by contrast, on the higher end, created a culture around this. They followed it up with training, with coaching, with manager education, right? And that's when they get the really impressive bumps, and that's where we end up seeing results on the higher end of these ranges here, right? So there are 4 phases that we've identified that help an organization to become strengths-based if this is something that they do decide to build into the culture of their organization. So the first step is executive leadership and middle management alignment. If the senior leadership team isn't on board, nothing else happens, because monkey see, monkey do. Then we need to get the managers on board. Middle management is such a tough job because they're dealing with pressure from above and below. So getting them aligned with the senior leadership team around culture is important. Then the second phase, driving performance management, often goes along with those Q12 surveys, sitting down to open up the conversation in the team around engagement and helping managers reframe their focus towards outcomes instead of processes, right? Managing people instead of managing numbers. Then in phase 3, open up the Strengths Finder to all the associates within an organization, help them to understand their own strengths, how they can utilize those in their personal and professional development, specifically targeted towards work outcomes. And then in phase 4, sustaining the strengths culture, there needs to be a capstone. So that requires training internal consultants within an organization to be able to coach to strengths and to onboard people through strengths. So this is designed to be not an ongoing thing, but a one-time investment to introduce this into an organization for long-term sustainability. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you at least a little bit about what 34 Strong does. This is what we do. Our primary offering is Core 34, which is a 3-year, 4-phase process that is outlined to help walk organizations through this process and give them all the tools that they need from start to finish for implementation. Often companies that they need from start to finish for implementation. Often companies won't necessarily start here. They'll start with what we call our base 34, which is just working with the executive leaders to get some exposure to strengths, create some buy-in, see if it's something that really makes sense for an organization to jump into. So at this point, I want to go ahead and wrap things up. So I've had a great time, setting this up and providing some info around strengths and engagement for you today. If you have any further questions around strengths or engagement, feel free to get in touch with me through our lovely sponsors today. I really look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you and seeing how we can continue to build out and introduce strengths into some more organizations. So hope you all have an excellent day. I've been Zane with 34 Strong, and thank you again for having me.